Hello, and welcome to another episode of Aiding Your Game, a short web series where we're talking about game aids and enhancing your tabletop roleplay. Today we're going to be here at my painting nook, so I apologize, the lighting isn't great, but it definitely gets me in the mood to talk about miniatures, miniature terrain, and tabletop miniature play. So let's get into it. Welcome to this episode. Today, as mentioned, we are going to be talking about aids in the forms of miniatures, miniature terrain, and gaming maps even will fit into that. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the miniatures first. Of course, miniatures are no new item for the hobby of tabletop role-playing game. They have been around for literally decades. When I was young, I used to love collecting miniatures. We would paint them with testers and model painting brushes. Of course, they were horrible, but it was so much fun. It became a hobby in and of itself. So I still love to use miniatures. I love to paint miniatures. I love to exchange miniatures with other painters across the world. And there are plenty of websites and manufacturers who create miniatures. Of course, they range from plastic style or resins even, metals, and a variety of other items. Now you can actually go and build and design your own at a couple of the miniature manufacturing companies. So it's a lot of fun and definitely can aid in the game. Of course, bringing that kind of spatial reality onto your tabletop role-playing game. As you're using miniatures or introducing miniatures into your game, you can discuss which directions best to attack from. You can visualize better the battlefields, even exploring some of the terrains that you're going with. The miniatures, of course, kind of bring that life, that extra life into the player's characters by having that visual representation that they can actually move around and see and touch and feel. And it is a great addition to the game. Of course, if you're having to travel to and from your gaming location, it can be a bit of a challenge to get miniatures to and from your games, especially if you're working on larger scales with packs of kobolds or goblins. And it can be a daunting task, but there are plenty of options to move miniatures from location A to location B. If you're lucky and you have a place that you play at home or at a business that you operate and run, of course storage isn't as important. You generally have plenty of places to put them. Miniatures for me started, as I said, as a small game aid and grew into a hobby in and of itself to paint and decorate and start adding more decorative bases and elements to it. That led me into some of the gaming terrain. Of course, with miniatures, having them interact just on a flat tabletop, whether it be wood or just a white laminate, is a little bit more challenging. Some of the additional game aids out there, including battle maps or area maps, are great. Many of them are dry erase, so you can draw the terrain or the features of the area right on it and then erase it and reuse it. Of course, these are fantastic in that they are very mobile and you can make them be almost anything you want. Moving from the battle maps into more tangible terrain pieces include things like your dungeon tiles or your similar type products where you can actually design and lay out complete floor plans or areas. An example of that is a modular dungeon piece that you can actually place on the table and put items or characters in so they can see the environment a little bit better. These are great in that they offer, again, that more tangible piece of visual representation of what the characters are seeing and interacting with. Again, just elevating that game. Many of the offerings in those are very robust, and you can buy entire movable pieces and create and design as you go. Some of them have fixed parameters, some of them are just tiles alone that you can snap, or they'll have magnets to pop them together so that you can create whatever element that you're trying to define. These type of game aids, as many of the game aids mentioned in previous posts, are there again just to elevate the game. They're not needed, and you'll find that, especially if you're a newcomer to the hobby, they are or can be fairly expensive when you look at it holistically. However, I've found over my many years of gaming that a little bit at a time adds up, and before you know it, you have so much material that you're able to make fantastic options for your players or for your GM if you're one of the players who are collecting. If you do have a good stable group, it's always a good idea to look at going in on those together. And depending on the route you want to take, it is a good hobby in and of itself, whether it's collecting, painting, putting together, or even just collecting. You can augment your game and the game of your fellow gamers just by having those pieces put together for playtime. We did receive a couple of requests to talk about how to build and paint both gaming terrain as well as miniatures. With as many tutorials as there are out there on those subjects, we are going to skip it and again just talk about the game aids themselves. So, when do you introduce and how do you use miniatures? I've found that for my campaigns that I run, I actually paint and give each of my players a miniature at the beginning of the campaign or near the beginning of the campaign. For me, this is just a way for me to thank them for participating. Again, hoping to build that investment of their time and energy in maintaining that game. And I try to pick a miniature that represents them as best as they've described it to me as the GM. So while it may not be an exact match, it has, in my opinion, helped them gain that extra appreciation for the game, for that visual representation they can actually see and feel their character. Sometimes they've actually gone and, whether it's purchased or created their own miniatures to represent their characters in the game, which I love. If they put the miniature that I've gifted them up on a shelf somewhere, I am absolutely happy with that, because again, it's shown that their investment in the game has grown. So I've found that for me, that's a great tactic that works really well, again, to invite my players to the table and get them invested in the game and build on that desire to game. While my players have additionally helped with things like bringing miniatures, they'll find something really cool that they want to, whether it's encounter or terrain pieces that they feel they would love to explore. My table is always open for them to bring those game aids in. And again, it helps develop their passion for the game. Luckily, my group that I'm currently with is fairly experienced, and so they understand kind of the mechanics, that there are times we will use miniatures and times we won't. Close combat is a good example of when we do, just so they can see that spatial awareness and know how to best attack or defend areas that they have. At our table, we use a lot of gaming mats simply because I have to travel to the location, and moving many of the dungeon tile pieces that I create and build is just not realistic and would be extremely cumbersome. So while we use a lot of gaming maps, as we continue to build our studio and game space here at Green Oaks RPG Game Aids, that we're hoping to change in a big way by having a multi-tiered table so that we can build out those terrains and get a home location for all of those bits and pieces. I hope this has helped in some way add to your game. As mentioned throughout the video, of course, these type of game aids are not necessary to play any of your tabletop role-playing games, whatever those games may be. However, they do add an element to your games, in my opinion, increasing your players' interaction with the game and engagement to your game, as well as giving that visual representation that oftentimes can be overlooked without. While theater of the mind is fantastic, sometimes bringing out those elements to make it a little more realistic can really augment your game as well as your gameplay. So I hope this video was helpful. I hope it drives everybody to incorporate some additional game aids into their campaigns and onto their table. Our next session is going to cover a little more out-of-game ambiance. So I look forward to seeing you then. Until then, where will your adventures take you?